Good evening, everybody. All right, I'm loving the energy in here. We got a packed house. I think we picked a good topic for this evening, so thanks for joining us. My name is Ned Spang. I'm an associate professor of food science and technology in the Department of Food Science and Technology, and I'm the director of the Robert Mondavi Institute. I'm just so happy to have you all here today. I'm thrilled for the topic. It's very timely. I'm sure you guys are reading about this topic in the news, so we're excited to have this wonderful group of panelists talk to us. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Wind Racer for the wonderful wine that you might still be drinking right now. That was graciously donated. And before, yeah. And just a quick note that this discussion will be recorded, so just want to try to keep the noise down a little bit if you can in the audience so we can clearly hear the panelists. And there will be time for Q&A after the first preliminary discussion here. Before we begin, we should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Quechel-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzal-Dehi Wintun Nation, and Yoche-Dehi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of the land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. And tonight, we are honored to have Ashley Stokes with us. Ashley Stokes joined UC Davis as the Dean of the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences in July 2025 from the University of Tennessee, where she was a professor of veterinary large animal clinical sciences. Dean Stokes also served as Dean of the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture's UT Extension. She has more than 30 years of experience in higher education and has hit the ground running here in Davis. Welcome, Dean Stokes.
Well, good evening. This is fantastic. I agree. Seeing this fantastic group here is wonderful. I know we're going to have such a great discussion tonight. I'm really looking forward to it. I am a veterinarian, and so thinking about health and food and the science and how this comes together, I'm just really looking forward to this discussion. It's going to be really, really wonderful. And so just thinking a little bit about the history here as well, and I know earlier we saw some slides up on the screen with some of the history. University of California started in 1880 in studying wine and that being established, and then the department here in 1935. And so we have extremely robust and really interdisciplinary research in the areas of wine and viticulture, enology, and then thinking about too with our students. Our students, they really gain so much hands-on learning with what they do. Some of you may have heard we have a student wine now as well. It goes to support scholarships for these students, but it really showcases just the breadth of the learning that they really receive here. And so we're really proud of that. And so, like I mentioned, we don't shy away from challenging topics, and thinking about how we bring together just the brightest minds to be able to discuss that, and that's something that we're very proud of. And so Drs. Katina, Jacobson, Adams, and Waterhouse, just really happy that y'all are here with us, and so welcome. And then and I would like to invite my colleague, Bill Garrity, to come up. He's the university librarian, also the Vice Provost for Digital Scholarship. So thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you, Ashley. We're really excited you're here at UC Davis. The library's got tremendous partnerships with your college, and we're really pleased that you're going to be joining us. I'm Bill Garrity, University Librarian and Vice Provost of Digital Scholarship. I forgot my reading glasses, so I'll be doing this kind of exercise that is probably very familiar to many of you. Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, I've always wanted a pair like this. Oh, this side, okay. They don't fit my big head.
It's a prepared panel.
I know. Oh, my pacemaker. Okay. So anyway, I'll tell you a little bit about Savor. Savor is these are great, thank you. Savor is a collaboration between the Robert Mondavi Institute and the UC Davis Library. So the series is designed to engage the community on topics where UC Davis is providing new insights through its research on food and wine. At the library, we offer leading research collections on every aspect of wine, historical and contemporary, cultural and scientific, that make the type of research you'll hear about tonight possible. Throughout history, wine has been the center of cultural, medical, and yes, even now, policy conversations about the health effects of alcohol. Yet wine is more than just the percent alcohol printed on the bottle. Research regularly provides headlines about the health effects of other compounds in wine, tannins, polyphenols, antioxidants, making the conversation around wine and health that much more complex. To help sort us through it all, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for tonight's panel discussion. Andy Waterhouse, my neighbor here in Davis, is Professor Emeritus of Wine Chemistry with 34 years experience in research on the health effects of polyphenols in wine. He remains active in the field as editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Science of Food and Agriculture and is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Society of Chemical Industry, which established the journal 70 years ago. He is also active in the International Scientific Forum on Alcohol Research, which creates critiques of alcohol research papers. And he is the former director of the Robert Mondavi Institute here, and in that role partnered with the library a few years ago to launch the Savor series. So Andy, it's great to have you back on campus as we explore this topic that is so aligned with your research, and you will introduce the panel, right? And I'll return the glasses.
Thank you, neighbor. So tonight we have an amazing panel of speakers, and I think what's interesting about them is they all come to this question from very different perspectives. So I'm hoping that we'll get an idea of how people look at these questions differently. Laura Catena is a Harvard and Stanford-trained biologist and physician, author, fourth-generation vintner, and founder of the Catena Institute of Wine. Dr. Catena was a practicing emergency physician in California for 27 years, while also working with her family winery, Catena Zapata, and started her own wine projects in Mendoza, Argentina. She led her family's winery more recently to be voted #1 world's best vineyard in 2023. Lisa Jacobson is a professor of history at UC Santa Barbara. She is a cultural historian of the late 19th and 20th century United States with wide-ranging interests in the histories of consumer culture, food and alcoholic beverages, capitalism, and the census. Her research focuses on cultural reinvention, which you can see in her new book, Intoxicating Pleasures, The Reinvention of Wine, Beer, and Whiskey After Prohibition. And our third speaker is Dr. Sean Adams, who's a professor and vice chair for basic research in the UC Davis Department of Surgery. He also serves as the founding scientific director for the Center for Alimentary and Metabolic Science, a research group melding basic sciences and surgeons to promote cutting-edge science that is relevant to nutrition, human health, and clinical care. He has a special expertise in nutrition and metabolism, investigating the origins of metabolic diseases and identifying factors that promote metabolic health. I should mention that his research gets lots of attention. All right, so the way we're going to do this is we're going to have each of our speakers come up and give a short 5-minute or so presentation of the basic ideas they're going to be presenting, and then we'll have a discussion following. So I'm going to ask each of them to come up in turn. So Laura, please come up and give us your basic idea of what you're going to present.
All right. So this is my main thesis, if you want to read it, but I'll paraphrase a few things. That for the over 40, I believe the data shows that drinking alcohol in moderation is pleasure positive and health neutral. When I say health neutral, that means that the benefits and potential harms are fairly equal. There's also several studies, many, many studies, that show that people who drink in moderation tend to live longer. And the conclusion is that every person needs to talk to their doctor and make their own personal decision about alcohol. Please talk to your doctor and don't get your information from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and all those, or the internet, unless it's a peer-reviewed study. So, so this is one of the big things that I want. Sorry, I'm looking at the time here. One of the big things that I want to imprint in your head, when you see comparisons to tobacco, which it's a marketing strategy by the anti-alcohol groups, this is not a good comparison. Why? Because all the data shows that even at small levels of smoking, and to the left, we see cigarettes per day, so 0, 1 to 4 cigarettes per day, 5 to 9, and then relative risk of all-cause mortality. There's a lot of data, a lot of observational data on both smoking and alcohol. And as you can see, there is no safe limit of smoking. Even a small amount of smoking, I have a lot of friends, I'm from Argentina, I live around the world. A lot of people, I just have a cigarette here and there, I smoke with my friends on Friday. Well, actually, that's a pretty high-risk undertaking because at small amounts, it's very risky in terms of all-cause mortality. What we see with moderate alcohol, and this has been repeated over and over, and there's some critiques to what's called the sick quitter control. We can talk later about that, but that's not a valid critique with the last 20 years of data. But basically, people who drink in moderation tend to live longer. And there's all kinds of theories for it. I'm going to go through some of these theories later. But this data is very solid. And so when you read things like, the data on the benefits has been disproven, I completely disagree with that. And most of the scientists out there, the credible scientists that are publishing in peer-reviewed journals would disagree with that. So the next slide. Okay, so this is an example of one of these articles that are coming out that are terrifying to people who drink wine and love to have their little glass of wine with dinner every night. And you read this, we all know cigarettes cause cancer. The memo on booze hasn't reached everyone. And they're comparing, drinking. And heavy drinking can be compared to smoking because it actually does all kinds of bad things. So when I talk about anything good, it's only moderate drinking. And that's defined, by the dietary guidelines, up to 1 glass of wine per day for a woman or the equivalent in other alcohol, and up to 2 for men, and no binge drinking. But even in this article, when they interviewed doctors, they interviewed 3 doctors. Every single doctor said they're not telling people to stop drinking because if it's important for your quality of life, no oncologist would ever do that to somebody that is ill, because it would change their quality of life. And also there's all this positive data, especially if the person's drinking in moderation. So they might say things like, they don't need to completely abstain, but limit alcoholic drinks to a couple times per week and to social interactions and special settings. So this is important that the doctors are still well informed, but I am concerned that if all this data keeps on coming out, all these misinformed articles that some doctors might be reading, this information. Maybe it's a surgeon, that doesn't really read the internal medicine stuff and reads the stuff, and they start thinking, it is true that the benefits factor is no longer proven. So, or proven is the wrong word, but no longer present in the data. Okay, so the next slide. So this is the final slide for this intro phase, and this is a cardiologist that I know said to me, and I thought it summarized it: do you want to live longer, or do you only care about cancer? That's about moderate drinking again. And I thought that was a good question, because the data is nuanced. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And we'll learn more as the evening unfolds.
so. Okay. All right, the dire warnings have been everywhere. Alcohol of any kind and in any amount, we've been told, is unsafe. That blunt warning became even harder to ignore when Surgeon General Vivek Murthy issued a rare public health advisory on January 3rd of this year, declaring that alcohol was a leading preventable cause of cancer and should be labeled as such. In recent years, the health and science sections of the New York Times and the Atlantic Monthly have seemingly made it their mission to debunk the widely held belief that moderate drinking is harmless, if not beneficial. So, what can a cultural historian with zero scientific credentials add to the conversation? As someone who has studied alcohol's redemption and reinvention after Prohibition, I'm struck by the possibility that we may be in the midst of a major cultural shift. We may be witnessing the reputational demotion of the moderate drinker. For the first time since World War II, alcohol's place as an emblem of the good life may, in fact, be in jeopardy. Changing cultural norms are already having a notable impact on alcohol purchasing. Sales of mocktails have risen while sales of alcoholic beverages have fallen across all categories. According to one study, 69% of Gen Z now prefer cannabis to alcohol. And if trend spotting journalists are correct, Gen Z and the sober curious are now the driving forces of a neo-temperance movement dedicated to wellness and self-optimization. And some of you may be aware of the very recent Gallup poll that found a record low 54% of Americans acknowledge drinking alcohol, and a record high 45% now view moderate drinking as unhealthy. The reputational demotion of the moderate drinker has certainly raised hackles and alarms. Moderate drinking used to excite the enmity of only the most hardcore prohibitionists. As they saw it, the seemingly innocuous habit of drinking wine with dinner invariably led drinkers down the slippery slope to ill health, addiction, and ruin. When voters repealed Prohibition in 1933, the newly resurrected alcoholic beverage industry embraced moderation as their ace in the hole. They invested millions in advertising and public relations campaigns that enshrined moderate drinking as an essential component of the good life. A new image of the modern drinker took hold as advertisers, trade associations, and etiquette manuals, I love the Bacchus behave, gently goaded consumers to moderate their Prohibition-era excesses. The overriding goal was to transform alcohol from a vice into an ordinary, respectable pleasure. And the campaign worked. The new ideal drinker was a modern woman who recognized alcohol as an essential element of domestic hospitality and marital harmony. And the new ideal drinker was a career man who used alcohol to cement business deals and friendships without overindulging or spending beyond his means. My second observation is that scientific assessments of healthy and risky behaviors are often difficult to disentangle from moral judgments about what it means to eat well and live well. Scientists aren't just interpreters of data, they're also arbiters of cultural norms. I get why some folks see a stealth prohibitionist agenda lurking behind the scientific claim that no amount of alcohol is safe. It's easy to become cynical when the scientists, after being pressed, acknowledge that moderate drinking might shorten your life by weeks, not years. But there's also a cultural dimension to the scientific arguments in defense of alcohol as well. Let me give you an example. The industrial toxicologists and physicians who testified before Congress in the early 1930s, before Prohibition was repealed, they're testifying to say that Prohibition should be modified to permit light wines and low alcohol beers. And they're citing scientific studies showing that neither beverage, if properly consumed, was intoxicating. They cite quantitative data, they talk about rates of absorption, but their caveat, if properly consumed, was as much a cultural defense of fermented beverages as a scientific one. One physician at the hearings invoked the ordinary decent Frenchman standard to argue that wine was non-intoxicating when consumed with meals in a leisurely fashion, as the ordinary decent Frenchman would do. Other scientists and physicians cited as proof that wine and beer were salubrious, harmless pleasures their personal experience of drinking in a Parisian wine cafe or in a Munich beer garden where men and women engaged in convivial conversation and drunkenness was nowhere to be found. The scientists told Congress that drinking problems would fade away if Americans substituted wine and beer for cocktails and hard liquor, and they called upon lawmakers to regulate spirits more strictly than wine and beer. Their most significant scientific contribution, however, was to argue that context mattered. Alcohol potency alone did not determine intoxication, they insisted. The time of day, the duration of drinking, the social setting, the food on the table, and the mindset of the drinker, all of these factors also influenced alcohol's effects on the body. Today's scientific debates would undoubtedly be richer if we brought context back into the conversation.
Give you a hard blink. Right? I'm a walker here, so yeah. Thanks, Andy. Well, I'm the geek, really big geek of the group. Going to talk a little bit about science today. These were absolutely wonderful. I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you all today. As I was thinking about this title, I actually thought maybe I should change this. Maybe it should say something like, is wine an alcoholic beverage or a fermented food? Right? So I kind of, as I was putting this together and they had reached out to me to kind of give this talk, I kept thinking to myself, gosh, it seems like nutrition and wine seem to always be going together all the time. And I think that's something we need to always keep front of mind as we're having these conversations, both for context as well as just personal choice and so on and so forth. So quick disclosure, I do have a company that is interested in certain things that the gut microbiota make, so I just need to disclose that before all my talks, please, Jamie. All right. A summary of some of the things I'm going to talk to you about in the next few minutes can be found in this paper here that we just published. It's open access, and it's really all about considering wine in its depth and its complexity and all the molecules that make up wine. And this is a very different way of thinking about things than just putting everything in one particular box. They're not all the same. So if you're interested in talking about this paper with me afterward, please find it, or you can find it on the internet. But thank you. Next. Yeah, so what about the matrix, right? The food matrix, right? So when we think about food, we can't really think about one particular thing, right? It's usually eaten with, one food is usually eaten with a different kind of food, and all of these foods have thousands and thousands of molecules inside of them, right? So matrix matters, and context matters. For public health policy, I want to hover on this. This is kind of the take-home message right here. For policy and related research, it's myopic myopic to focus only on a single food component without taking the complex food matrix into account, and thinking about context of who's eating it. Are they a smoker? Are they physically fit? What kind of food are they eating with the wine, and so on and so forth? All of these things have to be thought through before we actually make conclusions related to wine and alcohol for that matter. Next. Recent examples, and some from the last 20, actually more than that, since about the late 60s. So there have been some examples of where we've sort of had a mono focus on one component of food and have totally forgotten the context and the matrix. Here are 3 examples here. Cholesterol, we've all heard of that, right? It's bad. It's going to cause cardiovascular disease. Well, when cholesterol is dysfunctional in your body, you will have a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And this led in 1968 to some recommendations by the American Heart Association related to eggs and to limit your consumption of eggs. Turns out to be, since eggs are just fine, they're actually perfectly good for you and carry along B vitamins and lots of great protein and other things of that nature. Saturated fats, same story. We've all heard about how bad saturated fats are. And we've studied that in my laboratory quite a bit in cells and mouse models and that sort of thing. So turns out the dirty little secret is that context matters. So whole fat dairy, for example, really has a neutral effect, and in some cases for yogurt, for instance, has a positive effect on cardiometabolic health, not a negative effect. And then my favorite soapbox, fructose. We've all heard of high fructose corn syrup. There are many out there who believe this is causing obesity, doing all kinds of bad things. Well, like with everything else, it's all in the dose, it's all in the context, and a lot of that is pure hype. Next. So I made this purple, hard to read. So wine is typically consumed with foods. Not only is the wine itself very complex in its molecular makeup, but think about it. Then you eat it with food. Oh my goodness. Talk about being very, very complex. And when you eat, there's a time and a dynamic phase to what's going on, right? So that adds additional complexity to the whole picture. So you can't just pull out one single thing like ethanol and call it good. Next. All right. In fact, beyond ethanol, what about the wine and food matrix, as shown here by our friend Neo enjoying a nice glass of Chardonnay? If you look at this, wine is made up of many, many molecules. In fact, I should have deleted this yellow box. It's really thousands and thousands of molecules. I had just grabbed some information from a paper, and I regret it. And I put a bunch of sort of structures of some chemicals up here that are in wine, just to give you a sense of things. Has anybody seen the ethanol in this? Raise your hand if you saw it immediately. A couple people, but most people didn't see it immediately, right? Why? Because it's among a myriad of thousands and thousands of molecules. And yet we focus on the lower right for ethanol in much of our conversation. We just simply shouldn't do that. Okay, next. How do we get to the dark matter of wine? How do we actually look at wine and food combinations to understand all of those molecules I mentioned to you? This is just one example with some Italian wines where this group took a mass spectrometer, a big fancy $1 million instrument, took the wine and extracted it, and next slide. From that, you could see the complexity here. This is just one depiction. It's kind of a complicated mathematical way they did it, but on the left is a red wine, on the right is a white wine. And you can see that in the bigger oval there, that's sort of the resveratrol and the polyphenols, all these things we've all heard about. But I bet many of you haven't heard that wine also has fatty acids and lipids and complex lipids and peptides and proteins and all kinds of things, and complex carbohydrates. And these are things like Dr. Carlito Labria on campus is studying, and other people here at UC Davis are studying. So it's a complex mixture. Again, is it alcoholic beverage or is it a fermented food? It gets very complicated, doesn't it? Next. So second topic, and to close the session. So it was already complicated enough. Now we add in the gut microbiota. Have folks heard about the gut microbiome? I think, yeah, it's sort of, it really is a very, very complicated story. So imagine you're taking in this beverage, you're taking in this food, and now you have these trillions of microbes in there converting all of this to all kinds of interesting chemicals. Oh my gosh, just got more complicated, didn't it? For every gram of stool, there's about 100 billion bacteria. That gives you a sense of things. Next. Anybody who knows me knows I like to talk about stool. That's what we do in my lab. So it's just one of my favorite topics. Okay. The gut microbiota also has a lot more genomic material than we do. So about 500 times numbers of genes and gene variants and things that we don't have. Next slide. And this leads to a tremendous potential for metabolic function. So our gut is really a very large bioreactor. That's what it is. And we're all walking around with this bioreactor. Everybody's been to the doctor. They've had their cholesterol checked, right? They've had their blood sugar checked. We know this, right? Well, it turns out in your blood today, there's at least 40,000 metabolites. 40,000. That'd be a very expensive test, right? But that's the truth. Next slide. And about 20%, at least, I think it's much more, of those molecules in your blood come from the gut bacteria. So, oh my gosh, think about it for a minute. You drink the wine, you eat the food, the bacteria start to go to town. Now you're creating all these new molecules. Some of them go in the blood, some of them go in your intestine, and so on and so forth. These are the sorts of things that our lab is very interested in looking into. Next. We can go next. Okay, so where are we with the state of the science, right? How do we actually decipher all of these molecules that I've been talking to you about? Next. I hearken back to my 1964 T-Bird, okay? I don't know why, this came to me, and I said, you know, right now, here we are. We're building the parts catalog for that 64 T-Bird right now. So using all those fancy instruments, all kinds of experimental systems, that's what we're doing. We're actually identifying all the parts, right? Next. Here's where we're headed, and we're already starting to do some of this in my laboratory and many other people. That's to actually start to assemble things and make some sense of it. Which of these molecules are important to your health? Which ones hit receptors? Which ones cause inflammation to drop, and so on and so forth. This is very much in its infancy. And then finally, we want to assemble the car. My car is not a convertible, but Jamie, I'm dreaming. But this kind of looks like my car. We want to assemble the car ultimately, and that's where, you know, physiologists, nutritionists, and other people all get together and start to put the pieces together and consider how that links to health. Okay, next slide. So, exciting frontier, where are we headed? Next. We can ask questions like, how can we actually get the parts catalog together and assemble the car to understand what drives specific health effects of wine and wine and food combinations? This is where we're at now. It's actually really, really exciting. Next. And then imagine a future where robust science, right? After we've done the cataloging, we've assembled things, and we've started to make some sense of it. Imagine a future where we could begin to think about combinations of specific foods with specific wines and so on, not just so much for the taste and the flavor and the enjoyable part, but what about the science? What about the health? What about the physiology? What if you have arthritis or something, and we find through all of these exercises that a particular kind of wine with a particular kind of food and diet pattern actually helps your inflammation? Imagine that future. I can imagine that future. Something we're very interested in. Okay, next. I think the second to the last slide. How do we build the catalog? There are ways now where we can actually interrogate your GI tract, your entire gut, as you eat a meal. And we can sample all through the GI tract using these special capsules, okay? And I don't want to tell you how we collect the capsule at the end, but it can be done. Our good friend Oliver Fien and a really great scientist, Dari Shalon, Dari created this device called a CAP scan that can collect from different parts of the GI tract. So you can actually see what's going on in real time once you've eaten a meal and drink a glass of wine. At least as a future thinker here. Next. There are other capsules that do sort of a similar thing. They'll actually sample from your small intestine, They'll sample from your small intestine, and then they'll close the reservoir when it hits a different pH and gets to your lower gut. You collect it and look at all the goodies that the bacteria made after you drank your wine. And with that, next slide, I want to thank you all, and hope someday this is in our future doing research here at UC Davis. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have a roadmap. You can see how broad and how diverse this roadmap is. Before we start our discussion, I wanted to just bring up one issue, and that is that the basis for the health claims for alcohol, and almost all foods, in fact, are based on epidemiological studies. I just want to make it clear how these things work so you understand where the data is coming from. Okay, so basically we gather data. There's different modes of doing this, but the studies that are most commonly cited these days are called prospective studies, where they gather data on tens to hundreds of thousands of people, okay? And the way you do that is you query those people with surveys or interviews, usually once at the beginning of the study. So you'll have a team of people issue surveys or whatever for 10 to 100,000 people and get data on their lifestyle, whatever you're querying, something about their drinking, something about their food, something about their exercise, whatever it is that you want to study, you build into that survey. Sometimes, so then the study goes on for a number of years, and sometimes those surveys are repeated, which improves the quality of the data, but often they're not, okay? Now, what you measure is usually mortality. And the reason you have 100,000 people is that in 5 or 10 years, which is the length of time you can expect people to wait, a certain fraction of those people will have died, okay? And you collect the data on who died and who didn't die. That's usually very clear. And sometimes you try to gather data on cause of death. That's much trickier, depends on the reporting systems that are available in those countries or whatever, okay? You then take the people who died and the people who didn't die, you segregate them into populations based on the survey data. Do they drink? Do they not drink? Pattern of drinking, perhaps, whatever, okay? And then you compare the mortality rate of these different populations. So the people who did drink, people who drank a little, the people who drank a lot, et cetera, all right? Now, you have to do some corrections because certain lifestyle factors such as smoking have a huge impact on mortality. So if by chance your drinkers smoke more than the non-drinkers, they would completely skew the data because smokers die at least twice as fast as everyone else. So you have to correct for those factors. And other factors are important too. Educational levels, income levels, all affect mortality at very well-established rates. So you do the correction. Okay, then you get your data. Now, one of the key weaknesses is that this is an observational type of study. In other words, the people who are drinking and not drinking have all self-selected. It's not a randomized study. So this is one of the key weaknesses of all epidemiological studies. And keep in mind, this is pretty much everything that's out there. If we look at food, which foods are better for you, what diet's better, it's all based on people who have self-selected this diet, this drinking pattern, what have you, okay? Now, today there have been at least hundreds of studies on alcohol and health, and I'll go back to what Laura said. The overwhelming consensus of these studies is that moderate consumers of alcohol have the lowest rate of mortality, okay? So it's lower than non-drinkers and lower than heavy drinkers, okay? And the reduction of that mortality is due to a lower rate of cardiovascular disease, okay? So heart attacks are lower in people who drink moderately, okay? And the reason it has an impact on total mortality is this is the major cause of death in Western countries, okay? Now, we could get more definitive data, and Laura will talk about this, with a randomized trial where people are assigned a certain amount to drink, what have you, right? But these are very difficult to do. Not only because it's expensive, et cetera, it's very hard to get people to actually change the way they eat and drink, okay? Perhaps you've had some challenges yourself trying to change your own behavior, right? Just think about trying to get 10,000 people or 1,000 people to change their behavior based on the track that they're assigned to in a scientific study. All right, so now we're gonna go to some questions. Okay, is this on? Okay. All right. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Adams, And looking at epidemiological studies, perhaps, if you have in mind, can you explain how those studies differ, whether they study an ingredient or a food?
I'm not sure how to answer that, but I'll attack the general question. So the question is, yeah, so how do you actually begin to form hypotheses, say about an ingredient like cholesterol, which is, heavy in eggs, right? And link that then to a food. Is that sort of the question?
Yeah.
Right. It's very tenuous. So first of all, epidemiological studies are hypothesis generators. When you look at an epidemiology study, they're very, very important. But what they turn out to be is a hypothesis generator. So if you start to see a statistical association, say of cardiovascular mortality with, total cholesterol consumption or something of this nature, that's a hypothesis. That would suggest, oh my gosh, if you eat cholesterol from any source, that can increase your risk for cardiovascular disease or death. But the tough part is, different foods that contain cholesterol may behave differently because of their matrix, how they're consumed, what they're consumed with, and so on and so forth. So that would be my answer, is it's really difficult to sort of deconvolute a single ingredient from the different foods. And plus, these questionnaires and all these things are notoriously inaccurate. And so how many eggs did you really eat this week? What are your other sources of cholesterol, and so on and so forth. So again, epidemiology is important. Sometimes you get a really clear result, like smoking. But many times it's these sort of nuanced results you get from, in nutrition epidemiology studies, you need to keep peeling the onion back, no pun intended, to really understand what's going on. I don't know if I answered that appropriately, Andy. But
Yes, thank you. All right. So now turning to wine, Laura, as you mentioned, there are many press reports that show or that claim that drinking is not healthy. I won't go into, you can discuss like what they're observing. Can you explain how do these studies show that wine or alcohol might not be healthy? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah. And I think all these comments around observational data are really important because something that you're going to read in these articles is, oh, well, the data on the cardiovascular benefits has been disproven recently. You've probably read that 10 times in this last month. And because it's observational data. Yet all data is observational on all nutritional studies, mostly for large studies. There is some randomized controlled data on some things, but for large studies, it's mostly observational. So both for harms and benefits, it's observational. So it is true, though, that it's a hypothesis. There's a question. We can't be sure until we do a randomized controlled trial. So the better word to use is association. And that's one of the big errors that's used by the normal media is, this cause, any amount of alcohol causes cancer. They could say there's an association with even small amounts and some cancers. That would actually be a correct statement because with observational data, you can use the word association. So the words are important. And so this is a really, really important study that I know you're all very interested in this topic. I would just Google National Academies, NASM, alcohol and health. And the study is really long. It's peer reviewed. It's like a book, but there's actually a really nice summary of the results that was prepared by the National Academies. And as you know, the National Academies is a very, very reputable group of scientists around the US, top institutions, and they were tasked by the Dietary Guidelines Committee with looking into the question of moderate alcohol drinking versus not drinking. And it's a really beautiful study because they did moderate drinkers versus never drinkers. So the question of the sick quitter that has always arisen when looking at this data, people say, oh, well, they compared drinkers to ex-drinkers or to sick people who had to quit. Well, that's not a good control group. I agree with that critique. So these people really compared moderate drinkers to never drinkers. And look at all the things they controlled for, because the big problem with observational data are the confounders. Smoking, for example, would be one. but they controlled for age, sex, socioeconomic factors, physical activity, smoking, some mixture of comorbidities and body habitus. So it was just a really, really good look at the data, peer-reviewed. And what they found was this lower mortality that we've been talking about that most of the studies find. And this was published, it was published in December 24, but it was issued in January. So it is very recent. So when you read in the newspaper, oh, recent articles show that there's no health benefits, well, this is a very recent review. And it showed lower mortality, lower cardiovascular death, and increased risk of breast cancer that was somewhat milder in percentage. And when you read that, it's very terrifying for anybody. We all know somebody with breast cancer. It doesn't mean that your risk goes from 10% to 20%. It means that your risk goes from, if it's 10, it might go to 11. And again, association. You don't know for sure. Every person is different. You have different other factors. Just like you have different foods that you take, you might have other risk factors. So really, you can't standardize any of this information. But this is what the National Academy's study showed. And then the next slide. This is monumental, but nobody reported on it. I actually wrote to the Wall Street Journal person that's been writing all the articles, and I said, have you seen this? She hadn't seen it, which is crazy because it's in circulation, and this journalist has been writing a lot about alcohol and health, and they decided not to cover it. But the American Heart Association is the main body of cardiologists in the US. So the American Heart Association is extremely reputable. It's the leading, everybody who's a cardiologist belongs to it. So they looked at all the data, and when it says RCT, that's a randomized controlled trial, most of those are quite small. So that's why it's hard to tell, like what's better, a small randomized control or a large observational? I don't know. The best is a large randomized control. So obviously, and then they found different things, so they found some positive, some negative evidence. And then for high alcohol consumption, a lot of negative, and that in cardiovascular health. And that's something that I think is a little bit confusing because people say, is it good for my heart or is it bad for my heart? Well, it's only potentially good if you drink in moderation. If you drink too much, you have risk of things like atrial fibrillation, and actually your risk of even heart disease, like heart attacks, actually goes up with drinking too much. So there's a really fine line. And one really good observation that struck me about the article, because they were very cautious. They weren't telling people, hey, go out and have a drink. They were saying, this is what the data shows. And they said that there's also data that when people get told that drinking wine might be good, for example, like the 60 Minutes thing, they tend to drink more. And that's actually a bad outcome. So we have to be extremely cautious, especially people in the industry. I have a major conflict of interest. I'm a wine producer, You have to be really cautious telling people, oh, wine is good for you. That person might go and drink too much. So you have to qualify the information. And then the next slide. So I have put all this information, there's all the references down here into the slide. And basically, just like what we've been talking about, this is a complex topic. There isn't a black or white answer. And I'm doing all of alcohol because most of the really big studies don't differentiate between wine and beer or spirits. There's just not enough patients to differentiate. But there are some studies that do differentiate, but we're not going to talk about that today. But look at, for example, all-cause mortality. People over 40, decreased risk. But if you're younger than 40, you don't have cardiovascular benefits, and any drinking would increase your risk of accidents because a young person might generally not drink a lot, but then they get drunk and they get in a car crash. So actually, drinking for young people does increase mortality, doesn't decrease it. So that 40-year-old is an important distinction. And then cardiovascular health, generally, it's improved except for atrial fibrillation. Even small amount of drinking might increase your risk of atrial fibrillation. And then cancer risk, this is interesting. Most people don't know this data, that actually some cancers are lowered. There's an association with lower risk of thyroid, renal, and some heme malignancies with moderate drinking. Most people, did anybody know that? No, most people haven't heard of that.
I didn't know that.
No, it's really good data. It's really good studies. And then this is the really important one. Heavy alcohol use is bad at everything, and we need to always repeat that over and over. And one of the things that's concerning to me about a lot of these articles is that they talk about moderation, then they switch to the effects of excess drinking, and then whoever's reading the article never knows if they're reading about what happens with excess drinking or with moderate drinking, and that's an important distinction. So I think that's my last slide. Yeah.
All right. So now, talking about moderate drinking, in the old days, back in Greece, there were two types of drinking that we hear about. One was the symposium, where you met at somebody's home and you drank no more than 3 cups of diluted wine. And then there was the bake, which was out of doors. You drank straight wine and lots of it. But today, the question is, how is moderate consumption being perceived or promoted by the wine industry?
Okay. So as the reference to ancient Greece indicates, the idea that alcohol can be enjoyed in moderation has deep historical roots. And I'm going to jump ahead in time to the early 19th century when the early temperance movement took their cue from Dr. Benjamin Rush, who created this moral and physical thermometer in which he says, well, there are certain kinds of beverages, water, of course, but cider, wine, and beer, that are perfectly aligned with temperance, that if you consume these in small amounts with meals, you will be cheerful, strong, healthy, and sober. But then, of course, spirits falls into that intemperate category. Spirits promote moral and physical decay. Now, through the rest of the 19th century, brewers, vintners, rabbis all continued to promote the gospel of moderation. But increasingly, they found a less receptive audience because the temperance movement hardened into a crusade to ban all alcoholic beverages. And one of the things that prohibitionists do is erase all distinctions among different types of alcohol. So demon rum doesn't refer to rum. Demon rum means wine, beer, and spirits. It's all the same thing. Now, you had some clever Italian-American winemakers like Andrea Sbarbaro who actually co-opted the language of prohibitionists and said, yes, let's fight the evil of intemperance. But his intervention was to say that true temperance, which is drinking wine in the French and Mediterranean fashion with meals, is superior to total abstinence. That message really didn't gain traction, in part because the chief exponents of the gospel of moderation, German-American brewers, Italian-American winemakers, rabbis, were all making these arguments at a time of intensifying anti-immigrant sentiment. So the moderation message doesn't begin to find a more receptive audience again until disenchantment with prohibition becomes widespread. And after prohibition is repealed, distillers, vintners, brewers all embrace moderation with 3 goals in mind. One is to rehabilitate the image of the industry, to demonstrate their social responsibility. Another is to distance alcohol from the disrepute and raucous masculinity of the saloon. And then the third is to reform American drinking habits. There's this idea that Americans need to be taught to sip and savor, not guzzle, their wine and their whiskey. And so, you know, distillers, brewers, and vintners each have their own variation of the gospel of moderation. So I want to talk about what's distinctive about the wine industry's casting of the moderation message. And the first thing is that they're really invested in this idea of casting wine as the temperate alternative to spirits. One of the ways they do this is through linguistic distinctions. So early on, they go after the word fortified. They hate the word fortified wine, wines of like port and sherry of 18% and higher. This is a neutral descriptive term in other countries, but it's a pejorative in this country because it's you know, people assume it means the wine's been spiked. They associate fortified wine as something that's drunk purely for its intoxicating effects. The other thing they do is try to heighten the wine industry's agrarian mystique. And this is part of that distancing from the distilled spirits industry. This also involves inventing new terminology. So wine manufacturers are supposed to be called wine growers. Wine is not made in a plant or a factory, it's made in a winery. And all of this is to sort of cast wine growers as gentlemen farmers and sort of cast aside their reputation as merchants of booze. The other thing they do, let's go to this slide, is sort of say that, you know, wine is the beverage of a new kind of leisure that's conducted in the home, where men and women gather together for convivial conversation, a quiet evening. And so the California Wine Industry's Trade Association ad campaign really emphasized this. Wine is part of gracious living, good conversation, but quiet living. And one of their favorite lines is, this is what busy, active people like to do, implying that you can enjoy your wine and still have a good work ethic and honor and fulfill your work responsibilities the next day. Now, one thing to notice about the ad is the strong presence of women. And I think part of the moderation message was inviting women in to be the guardians of moderation, that women were assumed to have a civilizing effect. There is a marketing aim behind this as well, and understanding that women are the gatekeepers who determine what kind and how much alcohol enters the home. And there's also an understanding that women are the swing voters who can turn a county wet or dry in a local option election. Now, the next thing they do, and you can go to the next slide, is to really strengthen the connection between wine and food. So wine is being promoted as a mealtime beverage, but also as a cooking aid that, you know, makes food scrumptious when added to the stew. And, you know, one of the things they do, the Wine Institute does, is go and, you know, tell restaurants, look, we need to set wine glasses on the table, put an unopened bottle of wine on the table. This will communicate the message that wine is a complement to the food, that in fact wine belongs where the condiments go. It's something that adds to the pleasure of the meal. Now, this ad on the left, Wine Changes War Dishes into Food for Kings, gives you a sense of how certain historical moments can really become major turning points. And World War II, because there were food shortages, food rationing, and rather onerous food control regimes that made mealtime rather dreary, the wine industry comes in and says, we've got a solution for that. You can take your cheap cuts of meat and throw some wine in and tenderize them. You have to eat leftovers again, throw in some wine, they'll be delectable. You have to eat an unfamiliar protein like liver or kidney or oxtails, throw in some wine, and now you have food fit for kings. This is company fare. And so the wine and food message keeps getting reiterated. One of their campaigns later on was to associate wine drinking with casual California living, wine on the patio with the barbecue. One thing I should add about the messaging on moderation is that none of the ads said how much wine was a moderate consumption. That was left up to the discretion of the individual consumer to determine what moderate meant. The other point that I think is worth making is that I'm showing you ads here. This is just a drop in the bucket of the publicity machine that is spreading these messages. So the Wine Institute is enlisting novelists and journalists and potables columnists and home economists and cookbook authors and makers of recipe leaflets that get distributed in grocery stores. So this is a very concerted campaign to communicate ideas that are familiar to us, but were not familiar in the 30s and 40s.
All right. Okay, thank you. Well, let's see. Time is moving on, so we're going to... I wanted, Laura, to go back to you. Despite this push to moderate consumption, there are some scientific studies that claim to show, and I think you alluded to these, that there is no safe limit to consuming alcohol. Could you explain how those studies, how did those studies come to those conclusions?
Yeah, so again, it is all observational data, and if we can look at, so this is a really bad slide. Like, I'd be fired as a professor, I'm sure. But it has everything. So why did the WHO come up with no safe limit at some point? They were basing that on the first study. This is Lancet published The Global Burden of Disease, which is this huge study that takes several years where they look at every possible risk factor. They look at diseases in populations. It's like a gigantic piece of data. There's like, I don't know, like dozens of scientists work on it. And they issue statements about the harms of different things. And they include things from like having sex to drinking alcohol in their study. And the Global Burden of Disease, which was published by Lancet in 2018, it was the GBD 2016, said no level of alcohol consumption improves health. And they made that declaration. Then WHO came out and they repeated it. Now, Lancet actually corrected itself, which I love that, because remember the measles study where the MMR leads to autism? That was basically fake data, and it was retracted, and it was not true. That was also a Lancet article, and Lancet did the right thing. When they found out that it was fabricated data, they retracted the study. That's what a good publication would do. And so actually, the Global Burden of Disease 2020, they looked at all the data again, and they reached the conclusion that for individuals age 40 plus, drinking small amounts of alcohol is not harmful to health. And actually, if you look here, lower risk, to health, actually, some drinking lowers your risk. So actually, the conclusion of this would be that actually there is a safe limit because small amounts might lead to better health. Lancet came out with that. Do you know what WHO did? In their website, they published a critique of this instead of this. So if you actually go to the WHO website and you look at Lancet 2022, instead of publishing this data, they publish what they think is, oh, it was not good data, their critique of it. So they stuck to their initial conclusion. They didn't change what they said, which I find it to be very dishonest, because if they were basing their statement on something and that changed, they should have changed their statement. Now, there is a valid point in terms of what do you mean by no safe limit? And that goes to that question from that doctor, do you want to live longer or do you only care about cancer? So, it is very likely that even small amounts of alcohol might increase cancer risk in some people. A small group of one of the cancers is breast cancer, which is a very important cancer, but it's 7 different cancers, mostly with heavy drinking, but there are studies that show some correlation with these, pretty small increases in some cancers. So if you're saying if there's anything bad that happens, then there's no safe limit, well, then maybe that's a correct statement. But generally, one does not say that. So for example, aspirin that you take, for cardiovascular disease, there isn't really a safe limit in terms of getting an ulcer. Anybody that's on aspirin has a higher risk of ulcers. But you don't think of it that way because there's such a great benefit. So I still stick to thinking that no safe limit is incorrect because of the lower mortality in most of the data, which was actually confirmed by Lancet in the 2022 publication of the 20 Global Burden of Disease. But what's very concerning to me is that most people writing these articles are not aware of this, kind of really big point, that Lancet changed their position. And so now all of you know this. Take a picture. Show it. Yeah.
All right. Okay, well, we'll do one more question. Dr. Adams. You've been talking about the ingredient question and alcohol as a single component. So I just want to have you focus on the question of so there are many studies, as we've discussed, look at all alcoholic beverages as though they're the same. There are some studies that have separated out wine, beer, and spirits, and they do find different outcomes.
Correct.
So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. For instance, should future studies really not treat them the same? Is there some reason for that? What are your thoughts about that question?
I'm glad you asked that question because I wanted to riff off of the previous speaker. So, yeah, I mean, you can't lump all of these together, right? So whenever you're looking at epidemiological data for any nutrient or any kind of food, you just have to be really careful that you're not lumping something together because it shares a particular ingredient. That's a major mistake, right? And so making public policy on, say, ethanol consumption without taking into consideration that one molecule can come in different packages is not accurate. It's just not good science, right? If you do it, it's okay if it's a hypothesis generating type of study, but you then have to keep going and keep working to understand where the source of the molecule is coming from. And that can be for anything. Fill in the blank. Again, saturated fat comes to mind. If you think of where we've been with saturated fat and its demonization, I'm not encouraging any of you to go out and eat 3 pizzas tonight, although it would be really good. It would be like really good. But sorry. But when you're consuming saturated fatty acids in the context of full fat dairy, I mentioned this earlier, that's a completely different conversation because of the complex matrix of most dairy foods. Again, don't go out and eat, a stick of butter tonight because of what Dr. Adams said. But you get the point, right? That what it's delivered in matters. And I think that's where sometimes, not always, but sometimes the epidemiologists could have done a better job.
All right.
And don't get me started on fructose, please. We'll be here half the night.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
So we can't be here all night, only half the night. And I know many of you have questions, so we're going to open the panel, the discussion up to your questions now. We are recording this, so if you can get Ned's attention and get the microphone, then and the recording of your question will be audible. All right, so we got a hand up over there. Now, do keep in mind that our speakers did have do have lots more to say, so the evening is not done yet.
Now it's on. Fascinating discussions. It strikes me from everything that you've said, Andy and Sean, that you're using the wrong approach. I don't think you can do a randomized control trial and answer this question. What I think you can do, and I've asked Laura this, is take studies like the Framingham study, where you do more observational, where you record. Because if you ask me how many glasses of wine I have, I might say 1 glass, but I may have had 5. But if you take something like a Framingham population where you've monitored, they're pretty honest and they're on board, and they just report what they have, and now you take a massive computer scan and look for the association, I think you can answer these questions. And I think I would trust that study. But what you're telling me from all the different components and sources of alcohol and all that stuff, you will never be able to answer the beneficial effect. So the question is, make it short, has the Framingham or some other study demonstrated a protective effect of alcohol?
Well, first of all, I want to tell you that the study that we all desire is being done. Can we see my slide? So this is, so.
I didn't say to set me up for this.
No. So it's, I'm so happy because I was really worried that I wasn't going to get to show this slide. So what you said is so true. And there's this big group in Europe that studies the Mediterranean diet, and it's called PREDIMED. They publish a ton of papers. And they're doing the coolest study ever, which the Spanish government did not want to fund, but the European Union did. And they already have 7,000 people enrolled. They're taking up to 10,000 people, 5 years. And the people get enrolled, and they get randomized to keep on drinking wine or not. So they're all, Mediterranean diet is stable.
Are they randomized, or are
They're
selecting
randomized.
on what they choose?
No, they can't choose. They come into the study already signing, if I get randomized to stop drinking wine, I will stop. And the coolest thing is that they check their hair, so they can know if they've been complying or not. So it answers all your questions. So actually, this study is currently happening, and they already have a large enrollment, and it's a very good study, and the researchers involved are, top of the line. In terms of, Framingham data, I mean, that's what NASEM did, the National Academies. They basically picked the best studies out there. They excluded any study that had, bad controls or too many confounders. And they did what you desire with the best databases, and only included those studies and came out with those conclusions, which was, the lower mortality, lower cardiovascular deaths, and this slight increase in breast cancer risk, not breast cancer death. So yeah, this UNATI study, you guys, 2029. And the other cool thing about this study is that it's going to be about wine, and it's going to answer some of this question about the differentiation. And some people have looked at the data on wine, beer, and spirits separately, but that would take too long to talk about it. Generally, wine is more protective. There's many studies where when you separate wine out, you have no harms. You have no increase in cancer.
We're going to get the red versus white controversy.
We're not going to talk about that because that's too long. But what I'm saying is, this study is coming up, and this is going to answer so many questions, and it's so exciting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to another question.
That's great.
Have you heard about it?
Yeah, I also had another question for Dr. Catena. That first slide that you put up, I thought was really wonderful. The one on the right that was showing the dip in the curve.
Yeah.
And I think it's 0 glasses of wine to 1. There's a clear dose effect. And
Yeah.
just looking at that for all-cause mortality, looks like it's 1 glass of wine, right? You flashed it up pretty
Yeah,
quickly.
well, that particular slide shows that, you get harms at 3. That's where observational data is very difficult, because it depends on the population you're looking at, the age group. So
But the inflection of the curve isn't.
you want to
that-
bring it up?
That's very
Oh, do you
significant.
mean the Lancet one or the first one I showed?
The very first slide.
Okay, so go to the, yeah. So what I have decided to do about the dose is to really stick to the dietary guidelines. the 2 drinks for men, 1 for women, because otherwise it's very hard. Was I hitting my microphone?
No, you
Yeah,
did great.
okay, so
Okay,
is
there we
that
go.
all sex
So
on the
actually,
right?
you know, like you only get here, you get to 0, you know, you start getting increasing mortality at 3.5 drinks per day in
Wait.
this particular database.
I thought it says 1. So it starts, the line starts to
So-
rise again
right,
after 1.
so 1 over to the left means, you know, the average mortality, and then at 1 drink is the best. You know, you
Right.
get 20% reduction. At 2 drinks, you still get some reduction, but you go into 10% reduction. And then at almost 4, you get to neutral effect, and then over 4, you get to harm. So
Right.
this is like a very rosy picture in this chart.
No, but I'm saying the dose matters, and it's saying your best protective effect for all-cause mortality is 1 glass.
You're correct. Yeah, that is what this slide say, that's the best. Yes.
But
Yeah. And
keep in mind-
association.
But keep in mind, even at 2 glasses a day, it's better than not drinking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got a question down here?
One comment and one question. One comment is that when they're talking about number of wines, glasses of wines consumed per day, that does not necessarily factor in whether they're drinking 7 glasses all in the weekend or 1 glass a day, period. You know, so the manner of consumption may make a difference as well.
It does, yes.
Could I
You-
try that
you
one?
should.
But I'm gonna turn to you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead and try
But
that one, yeah.
You have a good point. So are you just, you know, for most of these studies, are you just averaging, so on? I'm not an epidemiologist, okay, so I can get in trouble here. But usually that's controlled for in these sorts of studies. So they don't just, you know, sort of divide by 7 and say 1 drink a day. They have criteria for prevalence of times you drank 1 time per day, prevalence you drank twice, and so on, in a more complicated way. So my impression of the literature is those sorts of things are typically accounted for.
Yeah. So a study that didn't look into that just averaged, would not make it into the National Academy's database. So
Yeah.
it's a very good point,
It's a
because
very good
actually
question.
not drinking at all and then having 7 glasses in 1 day is binge drinking, and that's not protective at all.
That's right.
So it's a very important point, and a lot of people get confused about it. They actually think, oh, 1 glass per day, I'll just have 7.
Yeah, right.
And so it's really important. It's really important, yeah.
And the question I had was about the genetic differences in the populations being studied. And certainly we know that, for example, there's a genetic difference in the aldehyde dehydrogenase enzymes among Asians, certain Asians. And their ability then to metabolize acetaldehyde is markedly diminished, and that has been shown to be then associated with certain cancers. So whenever we look at these studies, including the Mediterranean study, et cetera, look at the population that you're looking at before we can draw absolute conclusions across the board.
And that's where the go talk to your doctor about it, because if you go to your doctor and you say, I turn bright red with a small sip of alcohol, your doctor should tell you to not drink at all. There is no safe limit if you have that gene. So it would be correct to say to that person that there is no safe limit of alcohol. So that's why, again, you're totally correct, yeah.
So this topic has been researched for decades and decades and decades and decades. And like you said, when you start looking at it in more detail, there's a lot more components in alcoholic beverages, especially in wine, than just the alcohol. So looking at something newer, is there any research on health benefits of non-alcoholic wine?
Do you know anything about it?
So again, to be honest, I've started to read a little bit of that literature this week in anticipation of this session. I don't think I've gone through the entire literature, but my impression is that there are some health benefits of non-alcoholic sort of wine products. However, my read, Sean's very naive read, is that there's also evidence of a differentiation between the two, where there can actually be health benefits of the alcohol-containing wine in a different way than the non-alcohol containing wine.
Yeah.
So if that's true, if I'm not crazy, which anybody who knows me knows I kind of am, but I think, you know, one of the arguments is that the ethanol itself in the wine, being a geeky scientist here, could have some effects to change the matrix and to change solubilities of different components of the wine and the food. And by changing that solubility, by having the ethanol there, you may get a different profile of the metabolites and things that get into your bloodstream and so on. That's a theory, but it seems like a reasonable theory.
So-
It needs to be looked at in more detail, in my opinion.
I think we can have a lot of hypotheses, and there is no large study on like what we have for alcohol products, we don't have it for non-alcohol.
Yeah.
But what I would hypothesize is that if somebody is drinking, 4 drinks, 5 drinks per day, or binge drinking, and they're having some no alcohol products, and that reduces their ethanol content in their diet, I would think it'd be very positive. That would be my hypothesis, but it'd have to be proven. And there might be some components, again, but then you don't have the ethanol that's potentially a blood thinner. Like the cardiovascular benefits might be related to ethanol. So yeah, hypothesis area.
All right, one more question.
Thanks. Also a geeky scientist, by the way. But my question is actually on the social side, because, there's a lot of discussion also about this social lubricant factor. And in today's world, where some of these younger generations are totally isolated physically and don't get together, how important is that factor? Is there any way, maybe this is focused for Lisa to comment on, but is there any data that actually gets at that?
I have no idea about data. The only thing I can tell you, hard scientific data, the only thing I can tell you is that this was an argument in the comment thread in response to that New York Times article, is your drink worth it? And a lot of commenters entered this kind of stage of bargaining saying, well, maybe it's not good for you, but it sure is nice to combat this loneliness epidemic, and the pleasures of good company are stress reducing, and so there was the kind of bargaining that moderate drinkers were doing in wrestling with this upsetting data that was not presented in a nuanced fashion, really did include that discussion. Well, there are other kinds of social benefits, the great conversations, and there is a loneliness epidemic, so people are giving thought to that.
All right. So we're getting perilously close to our closing time. So I want to give each of our speakers about 1 or 2 minutes.
One. I'm going to do it in one. I can do it in one.
To give us some closing thoughts before we all head off.
Okay, so number 1, moderation, the same thing they were doing after prohibition. If you're in the industry, you have to be really serious about moderation. Spit cups, everything you need to do for moderation. And with food, because less alcohol is absorbed when you have it with food, or it rises more slowly, so it's healthier for sure. The positive effects, don't believe these articles that say that they're no longer thought to be positive effects from moderate alcohol drinking. That debate is still going on. And then the last thing is we have to defend the potential positives, because otherwise there won't be any more studies done, because they won't be approved by ethics departments. So we need to champion what the data shows so that more UNAPIs, that study I showed you in Spain, are done all over the world.
What a fascinating panel. I mean, I've learned so much from my scientific colleagues. I don't know that I have big concluding thoughts other than to return to this notion of context matters. I think that their culture and science both reside in the glass, and that all of these factors. There are multiple factors that really have to be considered when thinking about the pleasures and perils of alcohol.
Yeah, I guess I'll end with a question. You know, what will we do as we start to sort of unmask these thousands of metabolites and things that are in the wines that we test, you know, with our new technologies, our new omics technologies? As we grind through all these samples, as we start to think about the combinations with food and how the molecule milieu looks then, and we start to find some factors in there that are known to be healthy, like, oh my gosh, look at that. That's a known health-promoting compound. And look at that one. We didn't know about that one. And as those start to build, and I think they will, what will be the messaging then? Is again, it gets back to, is it a fermented food or is it an alcoholic beverage or a little bit of both? So I think these are the things we'll see in the future as we apply more sort of omics technologies and things to looking at wine and health.
All right. Well, I think Ned's going to give us some closing remarks, and I want to thank our speakers for all the insight we got tonight.
Let's hear it for the panel here.
Lisa's book.
Thank you all so much to think about. I think what we heard tonight was really this context piece, as Lisa was saying at the end, but really, you know, thinking about ethanol in the context of all those other molecules, wine in the context of the food you eat it with, the wine and the food in the context of the microbiome that you're digesting. And then we're also hearing the context of the scientific approach to how we even try to analyze this data. And then, of course, the broader socio-cultural and historical component of alcohol. So really, you guys covered a lot of ground in about an hour and a half. So thank you for walking us all through that, a tremendous amount of knowledge. Really appreciate it. I think we are left with one question here, where when we think about all that context and all that nuance, how do we communicate this effectively in a world where we just want to click on something and decide if something is good or bad? So that still remains. We really have to figure out how to communicate these things and how to communicate the science, not just with wine and health, but with a lot of the things we work on. It's so unsatisfying sometimes as a scientist to do all this hard work, and your conclusion at the end of the day is, it depends. And so I think we're left with a little bit of that this evening. So anyway, I want to thank you guys all again. That was a wonderful panel. Laura, Lisa, Sean, and Andy, well done moderating. Just really, really fantastic. Thank you all. One more round of applause for these guys.